IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Today we're going to be talking about Christianity in India. Now, when we think about Christianity in India, there's two things that generally pop up. The first is Syrian Christians, who are often to be found in Kerala. And the second, of course, are the Portuguese, who took over Goa quite violently in the 16th century, and over the course of the 17th century unleashed a series of extremely violent persecutions of non-Christians in their territory. Now, there's a lot more to Christianity in India than these two things, as you can imagine. From its original arrival, ostensibly with St. Thomas, one of the original disciples of Jesus Christ, all the way to the present day, Christianity in India, and specifically in South India, has some really fascinating and organic kind of practices and rituals that it's picked up over the millennia that it's been a part of India's social, cultural, and religious fabric. I have with me today Vivek Joseph. Hey, Vivek.
Thanks for having me, Anirudh.
It's our pleasure to have you. And the last time that you were here, Vivek, we had a really interesting conversation about this Deccan god called Mallanna or Khandoba, and how multiple religious communities kind of participate in his worship. Do you have something similar in store for us today?
Yes, I do. So I thought it would be great for us to talk a bit about Catholic saints in Tamil Nadu and how they are venerated by local Catholics and how they are actually worshipped by many local Hindus.
Why do you use an interesting term there, veneration? How is that different from worship?
Well, within Christianity and specifically within Catholicism, there is a very distinct demarcation placed between worship and veneration. So in a monotheistic faith such as Christianity, there is only one God, and so worship belongs to God alone. All worship needs to be directed to God alone. So, with regards to saints, they aren't considered divine figures, but rather just human beings who have been particularly blessed by God. And so, because of that close relationship to God, they deserve to be venerated. And by veneration, we mean honor. So they are not worshipped, but rather they are given respect and honor owing to their relationship with God and the sanctity of their lives.
Interesting. So you mentioned that there are some practices that Catholics and Hindus kind of have in common, right? They're worshipping the same saint. So do we see them also using similar forms of worship / veneration in order to do so?
Yes, there are. So I think if we look at various traditions that have been quite ingrained within South Indian society, as well as in the broader subcontinent in relation to honoring individuals who are considered divine or supernatural or particularly blessed in certain ways, we see that various religious communities share common forms of devotion. So, specifically when we look at Tamil Catholics particularly, South Indian Catholics at large, but Tamil Catholics particularly, we see many performing various acts of devotion that are also performed by individuals who identify as Hindus to local deities or various more pan-Hindu deities. So it's not uncommon to see statues of saints being garlanded with flowers, offerings of coconuts or food being given to the saints, being given to Christ or one of his saints, and later the food distributed to devotees. So these are various forms of devotion that sort of cut across religious lines and essentially boil down to for showing forms of respect to a divine figure or a supernatural figure in order to gain their favor in some way.
That's quite interesting. I remember when I studied in Goa, I would frequently come across these little shrines at crossroads, and what really struck me about them is that invariably either the cross or a representation of a saint would be garlanded, and I always thought it was a little odd because that's not necessarily it seems to be a very Hindu thing. Right? It's generally thought of as a very Hindu thing, but very obviously it's not. It's a more kind of pan-Indian religious practice. So that's quite interesting. Now, can you give us a few more examples of this kind of thing happening, though, Vivek? For example, chariot processions happen in a Christian context?
They do. In South India, particularly with church festival. So a church festival the Catholic term for it is a feast day. So it is a day dedicated to a particular saint. It's usually the day that he or she died. And it's a bit odd we celebrate a death day, but essentially the idea behind it is they believe to enter into heaven on that day. So it's an occasion for celebration.
Hmm.
So a church festival ends with the feast day, but it begins 9 days prior, and it's called a novena. So a novena is 9 days of prayer, continuous prayer, and it's an ancient Christian tradition. It's something that you find across the Catholic world. And novenas are huge occasions because they are community celebrations, and various groups come together to celebrate a saint. It's a time for venerating the saint. It's a time for praying to God, but it's also a time of community cohesion. And when it comes to South India, particularly, we see various traditions that we generally think specific to local religious traditions being carried over into Catholicism and novena
Hmm.
celebrations as well. One of this is, as you said, the car processions. And on the last day that is a feast day, the last day of the church festival, usually in the evening, it's very common for the community to take out the statue. Now, you need to remember that Christianity does not have idol worship, so these are just statues. So they're representations of Christ or the saints.
Hmm.
And but the statue is taken out in procession. In Tamil, it's called a ter. In Telugu, it's called a ratham. So the same terms that are used from Orthodox Hindu temples to local heterodox shrines to refer to a chariot that is pulled by devotees around the neighborhood. So the presence of the saint is sort of taken around the neighborhood, and devotees offer flowers, candles, etc. to the figure.
That's very interesting. So I'm a medieval India nerd, as long-term listeners of All Things Policy will know, and I've come across these very elaborate kind of agamic texts from Tamil Nadu, from roughly the 12th, 13th century, which talk about the ritual and religious and metaphysical background, really, of these chariot or cart processions. It's so fascinating to me to hear of another community actually looking at that practice, seeing that it kind of fits well with their own idea of how their saints or their sacred figures should be venerated, and kind of adapting that almost organically and seamlessly into their own practice.
There's actually another aspect to this, Anirudh, because in a lot of Western Catholic societies, Western Catholic cultures, taking statues of the saints in procession is also a very popular tradition. And in South India, we find a very interesting convergence of two ancient traditions of, well, chariot slash religious processions, wherein communities decide to take the figure they are venerating or worshipping into the neighborhood so that their neighborhoods are blessed and protected in various ways. So if you look at processions of saints are extremely popular in Spain, Italy, Portugal, and by that extension, Latin America and the Philippines as well. So it sort of fit very snugly within South India in many ways because, like you said, with regards to the ancient, well-established textual tradition of chariot processions as well, it was only quite natural for Catholic communities who were already used to these celebrations to sort of blend a pre-existing Christian tradition and a pre-existing local tradition together.
That's fascinating. Are there more examples of this kind of dynamic at play where you have a pre-existing Catholic tradition that kind of merges into a local one and turns into something that's very much its own kind of thing?
So I think the best way to explain this would be by bringing up an example of a popular shrine in Tamil Nadu and a set of rituals that take place within the shrine, as well as in other shrines across South India. So just to give you a little historical context, when again, Christianity, various denominations of Christianity spread simultaneously within across South India from the late 16th century on, from the late 15th century, sorry.
It's a very important point, I think, is that very often Christianity is kind of thought of as a monolith, whereas in reality, you actually had many different competing orders and groups within the overall ambit of Christianity that were competing for followers and converts in South India at the time.
Exactly. So, since we are talking specifically with regards to Catholicism, even within Catholicism, you had Portuguese missionaries, French missionaries, later on English and Irish missionaries who who were also part of different religious orders with their own ways and perceptions of looking at conversion or looking at spreading the faith or interpreting Christianity as such. So, what generally happened, the Portuguese were the first to begin conversion within what is now Tamil Nadu, as well as the Elam in Sri Lanka. So they brought Christianity to local coastal communities, and many communities enacting various forms of socio-economic or political agency decided to convert into Catholicism. Now, when communities convert, the missionaries would generally set up a church or a shrine, and since there were very few initially for quite a long time, there were very few priests who would officiate over official religion. So I think one thing I probably need to mention here is within Catholicism, you have official ritual. That is, you have ritual, that is worship, that is structured by the church. So this is what we'd call the Holy Eucharist or the Holy Mass, which is essentially the core of Catholic practice, wherein we believe that that is the only real form of worship, and it's what Catholics go to participate in whenever they go to church every Sunday, for example. And while there is official Catholicism, official ritual that is textually prescribed, there is also popular Catholicism. And this is generally referred to as popular piety, which refers to a variety of practices that generally pertain to life cycle processes, life cycle events, daily, and kind of pertain to daily needs and intentions. So when there was a lack of priests generally that was a trend with a lot of early Christian communities. A shrine was generally set up, and while official religion, new converts could only participate in official rituals very sporadically, they developed various traditions of popular piety, and this is when they brought in pre-existing forms of devotion into Catholicism. So the coconut breaking or the garlanding or the chariot pulling, etc.
Fascinating. So at this point, Vivek, I mean, I just want to like pause here because you've highlighted two things I think are really crucial to our understanding of Indian Christianity, as it were. Um, Very often, this the whole business of conversion is described in rather disparaging terms, as though the people who are converting to Christianity are essentially gullible to being won over by missionaries. But the term that you used, that they're exercising a form of agency in order to do that, I think is really crucial, because in general, over the grand course of Indian history, like or right down from the point where Buddhism starts to spread into Andhra Pradesh, for example, to the point where people in Bangladesh, peasants especially, converted en masse to Islam during the agrarian kind of expansion of the Mughal Empire. You constantly see local communities choosing to patronize religions out of a sense of agency, not necessarily because they're being compelled to do so at sword point. It's a way for them to rise in the world, essentially. And in that sense, I think it's also very interesting that they don't necessarily lose their roots, quote unquote, in any meaningful sense, right? Because in practice, it is impossible to enforce any kind of orthodoxy just given the sheer size and populations that we're usually talking about. These people choose to interpret and reformulate their new religion, their new religious practices in a way that they generally think about sacredness and worship and stuff like that. So it's very interesting to kind of have the curtain pulled back in a sense, and see how these communities kind of engaged with Christianity in the early modern period.
I think a lot of these interpretations of conversion as gullible individuals or communities being lured into a new religion comes from a very casteist perspective, because primarily a lot of these communities that convert en masse are Dalit and Bahujan communities. And this is also the case with many Tamil Catholic communities who converted during the Portuguese era. The best example that I could think of, which sort of leads us into the shrine that I wanted to discuss, is a community called the Parvars. And the Parvars were pearl fishers who heavily engaged in trade along the southern coast of Tamil Nadu, as well as so they have a equivalent community called the Bharatars in the Elam in Sri Lanka. And the Parvas were at a very interesting point economically and socially because they were pearl fishers, they were considered lower caste. But because they were fishing pearls, they were at a they had a great deal of economic agency. And about 14 or 15 Parvar leaders decided to convert the community en masse into Catholicism. And they went to what is now Kochi, and they approached the Portuguese missionaries there, and they converted. And eventually, Portuguese missionaries would make their way to the Parvar settlements. And estimates show that about 20,000 Parvas, that is the entire community, converted to Catholicism. So the Parvas, like I said, inhabit southern Tamil Nadu primarily, the coast of Tamil Nadu, and a lot of their settlements gave birth to various shrines that the Portuguese patronized and the Portuguese helped build. So there was a great deal of agency enacted by the Parvas because they felt that it was to their economic benefit that they take Portuguese protection to protect their trade links. And it was also a form of escaping, in some way at least, the caste system and how it relegated them to a so-called lowly, impure position.
Hmm. This really reminds me of something kind of similar that happened in the Vijayanagara period, again in the Tamil country, quite interestingly. And I think, if I'm not wrong, this was roughly around the 15th century or so. Soon after Vijayanagara had first kind of like erupted into the Tamil country and had kind of split up the lands among its own kind of local warlords to maintain control of this fertile trading region. And what we see basically is that weavers who are considered to be kind of low in the caste hierarchy, but are gaining increasing economic power because of the expanding Indian Ocean trade and the demand for their textiles, actually rise up against Vijayanagara authority on a few occasions, with the end result that they're kind of brought into the edifice of imperial power and allowed to make land grants, which are commemorated through temple inscriptions. And this is very interesting to me because it kind of shows you that sometime in the early 15th century or so, you had a similar community to the Parvas, perhaps not so low down on the caste hierarchy, quote unquote low, of course, who were not satisfied with the position they had, and therefore kind of used their economic leverage to find a new place within the religious landscape that elevated them to a new position. And it's very interesting that the Parvas, who are doing basically the same thing, except in a much more diverse sort of religious climate, right? They have more options open to them. And therefore, they find that, look, if we're not going to be able to rise within the caste system, within the systems of Shaivism or Vaishnavism or whatever, we can do the exact same thing with Christianity. And it's a profoundly community driven kind of a decision, right? It's not the case that you have these missionaries coming in and sowing the seeds of disaffection or whatever, and kind of fooling or bribing these people into joining their religion.
Exactly.
You're seeing calculated decisions made by communities who want to rise higher up in the social hierarchy to kind of reflect their economic status.
Exactly. We see this well into 20th century India. We see this now, where communities who are trying to escape forms of oppression and marginalization enact agencies, enact their own wills to, find a better position. And this doesn't only have to be with Christianity, it could be with any religion, it could be escaping religion completely. So, yeah, the Parvas probably are interesting in another aspect, because even though they chose to escape the caste system in a way, post conversion, they maintain their caste identity. And within a great deal of shrines that are dominated by the Parva community, you have certain roles that only Pauravas are allowed to play. For example, pulling the chariot. So it's not to say that, like I said, there are various reasons why communities choose to convert, various reasons why individuals choose to convert. This is not to say that things such as casteism do not carry on into their new religion. So we need to see it in a extremely comprehensive way. There's no denying that casteism is an issue within Christianity in India as well.
That again is a very interesting point, right? Because very often people who convert to other religions, especially the quote unquote Abrahamic faiths, as they're often disparagingly referred to in certain sections of social media, they're kind of depicted as being less Indian than others. But the picture that you're kind of revealing to us is that they are profoundly Indian, just simply in the way they engage and continue to perpetuate Indian social dynamics.
Exactly, which makes it a bit tricky when you look at like what we are doing today, popular religious practice, because there are admittedly quite a few problematic traditions that are carried on, the caste system being one of them. But even in certain rituals, devotional rituals that are practiced by Catholics, they kind of emerge from patriarchal forms of marginalization or very casteist perspectives of society as such. So again, we need to be quite fair when we look at these traditions. We can't really romanticize them in any way. They sort of reflect Indian society in a very wide way rather than a very specific religious angle.
This is all absolutely fascinating. It's very interesting to kind of peel back the hood and see the dynamics at play within Indian Christianity. And to any listeners who might notice that my voice is astonishingly clear now, it's because my laptop has just now decided to detect my new mic, which I spent a lot of money on. But here we are, and let's continue with the next big part of our conversation today, which is about these shrines that you mentioned a little earlier, Vivek. So you talked about how there's a bunch of very interesting rituals that are performed at two specific shrines within the Tamil country. So, what are these shrines and what are these rituals that you had mentioned earlier?
So the first shrine is actually in Paravar country, and it's one of the most popular shrines amongst the Parva community as well as local Catholics. It's in a village called Overi, which is not too far from Kanyakumari. And the legend behind Overi is that it was established about 450 years ago. There's been a shrine on that site for about over 450 years. And it's dedicated to a Catholic saint, a particularly popular Catholic saint called Anthony of Padua. Anthony of Padua was a figure who lived in the 13th century or so, 12th to 13th century. And he is honored as a doctor of the church. That is, he's someone who contributed a great deal to the development and the writing of theology and doctrine within Catholicism. But while he has that very high title, he's actually more well known and extremely popular for being the patron of lost things. And essentially, Catholics, so when Catholics pray to saints, the essential idea is that since they're not divine figures, we're not praying to them, we are praying through them.
Interesting.
And essentially, we Catholics approach saints to intercede on their behalf to God. And because these individuals have had such close relationships with God, God is believed to hear their prayers in particular. So when Catholics go to shrines and visit shrines and offer prayers to saints, they're doing it to God through them, essentially.
So technically, if I were to lose my keys, I could ask Saint Anthony to help God himself, to ask God himself to help me find them.
Exactly, exactly. I think car keys are one of the most popular prayer requests to Saint Anthony. In some Catholic cultures, he's also known to be a patron of fertility, but particularly in Overi, he's actually a patron against the effects of black magic and sorcery, and he is a protector against malevolent spirits. And this is something that developed within the context of the Tamil country and within the context of Uvri. So how the shrine came about, legend goes that a Portuguese ship was passing by and the crew all got cholera. And one of the crew members began chipping a block of wood. and he carved out an image of Saint Anthony. And as soon as that image was ready, the crew was completely healed. At that point of time, they had reached a little port called Obirpatnam, which is today's Overi. And in thanksgiving to Saint Anthony, they established a little shrine for him. Saint Anthony is particularly popular across India, and the reason for that is the Portuguese again, because Anthony was a Portuguese saint. He came from Lisbon, though he settled down in a town close to Venice called Padua, which is why he's called Anthony of Padua. And so you find shrines to Anthony across South India, but particularly in Overi, he's well known for his powers over evil forces, quote unquote. So devotees, both Catholic and individuals who identify as Hindu, make their way to Overi. And they cut across the caste lines as well. So Overi is a Parava-dominated village, but though Paravas do have key roles within like local celebrations, etc., and within local church administration, all caste communities and all religious communities are quite welcome to Overi. And both Catholics and Hindus perform a set of rituals called, known in Tamil as by Nerchai. So Nerchai rituals are it's a pretty common concept across the subcontinent. These are essentially vow rituals, wherein an individual makes a sort of a contractual agreement, as it were, to a deity or to a supernatural figure that they would do such and such if they are granted so and so. So it's like, promising Venkateshwara of Tirupati that you'd shave your head if you will pass
which
it
my
and
mom
stand it.
actually did, by the way.
So the same thing happens at Overi. The same thing happens at Catholic shrines across the country. Again, another example of local forms of devotion and religious practice being carried over into Catholicism. So, for aspects of Nerchai include, forms of Nerchai include, head shaving. They also include animal sacrifice, though that is more popular in small shrines such as Overi, not really in more urban settings. You also have ear piercings. A particularly popular tradition amongst many Tamil, Catholic, and Hindu women, unmarried women, is to tie a talimala. A talimala is the Tamil name for the Mangal Sutra. And it's basically, the talimala here is a yellow thread with a pod of turmeric to replace the gold. And it's an individual who's taking the vow of the talimala essentially tells Mary particularly that if she ends up getting married soon, then she will make an offering to Mary and tie the tali mala around Mary's statue. So as soon as the woman gets married, she comes back. All the while she wears the tali mala herself, and as soon as she gets married, she comes back and ties the tali mala around the statue of Mary. So these are various traditions that are nature rituals that are performed. In Overi particularly, it's head shaving, animal sacrifice. And in the case of animal sacrifice, there isn't really a priest involved. Occasionally, the priest might bless the animal, but it's just the individual offering it who sacrifices the animal. And again, it doesn't take place within the premises of the church, it takes place outside it. But later, the meat is shared amongst the community. And this is very similar to local religious practices of sacrifice. So the body or the blood doesn't really go to waste, but rather it's shared with everyone. And particularly in Overi, there's a tradition to feed individuals in fulfillment of a vow. And this is called asanam. And asanam, within the asanam ritual, 13 individuals are fed. You promise Anthony that you will feed 13 individuals, and these individuals must come from various caste and religious groups. So there's a sort of there is representation from all these communities within that particular ritual, and both Catholics and Hindus perform the asanam ritual and to fulfill the vows they make to Anthony.
Once again, there's so many interesting dynamics at play that I want to kind of unpack here. The first is the legend of its founding itself, right? Very often when we think about the spread of
Yeah.
Christianity, we think about missionaries going and setting up churches, but here we instead have a case of sailors who have had a profound religious experience, and who are coming and setting up a shrine that gradually becomes incorporated into the practices of the local community there, the Paravars, and also gradually spreads to attract more and more people. Now, let's try to like be critical here, right? And like you were suggesting a little earlier, Vivek, let's not over romanticize the way that these dynamics emerge, right? All these groups are entering into them with a clear sense that they're benefiting from participating in these kinds of rituals. They're not doing it because in the 16th century, somebody wrote a constitution saying that we must be secular and we must be friendly to all religious groups. There's something more organic happening here. So, in that sense, I find things very interesting that I hope we can dwell upon briefly. The idea that Antony is controlling malevolent or evil spirits.
So, with regards to how Antony sort of became a patron against the effects of sorcery and malevolent spirits, you can trace it back to the legend where he, well, essentially defeats the force of cholera, and cholera, as well as other diseases related to it, in South India particularly, are generally attributed to being controlled by specific figures, specific supernatural or religious figures. So in the case of, in the Tamil country, for example, the goddess Mariamman is said to control the poxes. So with Anthony being able to control something as such as cholera, which often is seen to be a product of, well, black magic or sorcery or the evil eye, really. It becomes quite natural that when he enters into the religious landscape, for locals to turn to him for healing, for solace in some way. Interestingly, and the dynamics of Anthony being able to control malevolent spirits also extends to his ability to counter the effects, the curses of local deities. So, particularly in southern Tamil Nadu, there are a couple of local deities. One is a goddess named Isaki Amman, and the other is a god named Sudalai Madan. And there are quite a lot of anecdotes relating to how individuals who displease these deities in a particular way end up facing their wrath. So are either possessed in some sort of way by a malevolent spirit, or are inflicted with black magic or sorcery. So essentially, when devotees are at the receiving end of Sudalai Madan or Isaki Amman's displeasure, they actually turn to Antony and ask for his help. A great proportion of the devotees who come to Overi for cures from black magic and sorcery are Hindu. In fact, local estimates say that about 40% of the pilgrims are Hindu. So it's fascinating because here you have a European individual who winds up in southern Tamil Nadu being asked for help to deter the effects of a local deity. And it's remarkable how organically this developed. There wasn't exactly concerted effort by either religious tradition to really make it happen, the leaders of either religious tradition to really make it happen. Antony just blended quite well and settled in quite well within the local religious land.
And you really can't draw a line and say that this is where Hinduism ends and this is where Catholicism or Christianity begins. It just seems so counterproductive that when we have such interesting and organic traditions staring us in the face, that so many religious groups seem to be on some kind of quest for purity today. But that's really a conversation for another day and another place. Now, are there any other shrines like this that kind of illustrate these dynamics of Catholic figure kind of seamlessly being integrated into local belief systems?
So, this is actually my favorite example, and it is Mary, or the Virgin Mary, the Mother of Christ. And Mary, again, is extremely popular in Catholicism, rather. She is probably considered the greatest saint, and that's because she is honored as the Mother of God. And so she's seen as particularly she has a particular ability to be able to intercede on a devotee's behalf to her son. So various Catholic cultures have very strong traditions with regards to Mary, and this is particularly true with Tamil Catholicism. In fact, I think if you look at various Catholic cultures within the subcontinent, Tamil Catholics have a particularly strong devotion to Mary. And um, this is particularly seen in one of the most important Catholic shrine in the subcontinent, which is in a little town called Velankani. Velankani is quite close to the city of Nagapattinam. And again, like Uveri, Velankani has a couple of legends with regards to its origins. It actually sort of begins not with the Portuguese, but with local communities who had by this time already sort of converted into Catholicism. And Mary is said to have appeared in the late 16th century at two separate times to two local boys. And the second instance was to a crippled boy who was selling buttermilk by the roadside. And suddenly, in the middle of the day, when the day was at its hottest, a woman carrying a child suddenly appeared to this little boy. And the woman asked for a cup of buttermilk for the child. And after the child offered the woman the buttermilk, the woman asked the child, "Why aren't you standing up? What's wrong with your legs?" So the child replies that, "Well, I'm crippled. I can't really walk." So the woman's like, "Well, nonsense. Get up." So the child stands up and he realizes that he can use his legs again, and he runs home. He runs to tell his mother, and his shocked mother calls all the villagers, and they ask what happens, and he says, "Well, a woman came to me, holding a little baby," and they take him to the local chapel, uh, and he sees a statue of Mary, and he recognizes her, and says, "Well, that is the woman," and so the locals on Thanksgiving build a shrine to Mary. Now, a couple of decades later, a Portuguese ship, which was on its way back from Macau to Sri Lanka, was caught in a storm in the Bay of Bengal. And the captain of the ship began praying to Mary. And Mary has various titles in Catholicism, and she's considered the patron of various things. And one of her titles is Stella Mari, which means Star of the Sea. So she's able to control the seas. And he asked Mary for her intercession, and if they are saved from the storm, he will build a shrine in her honor. And the storm abates, and the ship settles and docks down at what is now Velankani. And so the Portuguese sailors, about 150 of them, find a little shrine of Mary already. It's attached hut basically, and they start building a permanent structure there. And whenever the boat passed by, henceforth, they made it a point to stop at Velankani and build up the shrine. And so Velankani is the most popular shrine, Catholic shrine in India. It sees about 20 million pilgrims a year.
Wow. So, for context, 20 million is easily comparable to any of the major Hindu pilgrimage sites, as any Jyotirlinga site. 20 million is a lot of people.
Exactly. It's a lot of people. And Mary here is honored under the title Our Lady of Health. And the reason for that is the story of the boy with the crippled boy selling buttermilk. Because it was through Mary's intercession, her asking her son, that he is believed to have, the boy was believed to have been healed. And so the Tamil name for Mary here is Arogya Mata, or Our Lady of Health, which is, Health Mother, or Our Lady of Health. And about, like I said, millions of pilgrims make their way from across India to Velankani. About 35% of them, again, are non-Catholics. So primarily Hindu. There are many Muslims who do come to Mary's shrine, primarily because, Mary is an extremely honored figure within Islam
One
as
great
well.
example, of course, is the title of Akbar's, the Mughal Emperor Akbar's wife, Maryam uz-Zamani, the Mary of the Age.
Exactly. There's a whole surah in the Quran dedicated to Mary. So she here you find a confluence of devotees from three religious traditions who come to Mary asking for help. And well, she is the patroness of health here. And you can see why she is so popular. And like at Ovary and like at other shrines across South India, various Nechai rituals are performed, the most popular being tonsure, the most popular being head shaving. Devotees also practice various ancient forms of Catholic piety. One particularly popular tradition is, which over time became a Nechai ritual essentially, is so Velankani is on the beach and the area in front of the shrine is full of sand. So devotees actually kneel their way, walk on their
Yeah, walk
knees.
on the knees.
I
Yeah,
don't know how to
that's
really say that. Essentially, yeah. So they walk on their knees. They walk for a fixed period, for a fixed distance. They walk on the hot sand
wow.
as an offering to Mary. And Catholics do this. It comes from an ancient Catholic tradition of self mortification, which found a local context in Nechai rituals. So it again with other Catholic traditions that are seen in the rest of the world, a lot of them follow the same sort of logic as Nechai ritual. You do it in exchange for a blessing, really, or you do it as an offering. So again, you find within these Nechai rituals a confluence of various traditions. You have Western Christian traditions being practiced in the coast of Tamil Nadu, as well as local traditions being carried on
Hmm.
and finding new meaning and being dedicated to new figures.
It's especially interesting to me how mortification of the self kind of translates so well, just like chariot processions or the veneration of local deities who are responsible for disease and healing and that kind of thing. I remember when I went to Guruvayur when I was younger on a family vacation. I was really surprised to see guys who were actually literally just rolling all around the temple with their arms kind of held up and palms pressed together. And I was very surprised. My parents explained to me that this was a vow that they had taken to the god of the shrine. And of course, there's so many other examples of like mortification being used in quote unquote Hindu context, all the way back to the medieval period. People offering limbs, for example, to deities, people offering their heads to deities, specifically to mother goddesses. So it is so fascinating to see a Catholic mother figure also being worshipped with self mortification, and to see a practice, a cultural practice that originated in a totally different context, coming to India through these strange series of coincidences that allowed these global connections to emerge, and then gradually just becoming a part of Indian worship and social and cultural and religious practice. How absolutely fascinating.
When you say, when you mention the offering of well body parts, there's actually an interesting
Hmm.
tradition that takes place in Velankani, wherein in exchange for a particular body part being cured, okay, once a particular body part is cured, the devotee offers a tin image of the
Dude, the
body
same thing
part to
happens in
Mary.
Tirupati. This is so fascinating. I'm
Um,
starting to wonder if my mom should have offered a bit of my hair
and
to
that's
Mary at Valankalni as well to help make sure I got better marks.
the interesting part thing is this particular tradition of offering tin images is also practiced in other
Hmm.
Marian shrines across the world, particularly in Portugal. There's an extremely popular pilgrimage spot to
Hmm.
Mary called Fatima, and one of the popular acts of offering made to Mary is offering tin images. So again, well, the Portuguese context of Velankani sort of explain. But though Fatima actually, well, originate the Shrine of Fatima was set up only in the 20th century, but it has these traditions have earlier origins
Hmm.
within local Catholic traditions. But again, it's another confluence of a tradition that has a very common meaning, but comes from well different ends of the earth, really, in a small Tamil village.
Fascinating. Wow. This has been such a fascinating conversation, Vivek. Thank you so much for taking us on this interesting journey. Before we wrap up for today, though, are there any big points or dynamics you'd like to highlight?
I think, and this kind of best explains the popularity of Mary across Catholic and Hindu spaces. Um, when figures such as Mary, when figures such as Anthony entered into the religious landscape of South India, they like we talked about, they sort of merged within local religious traditions in a way that individuals from across communities found it very easy to appeal to both these new supernatural figures for their intentions. In the case of Mary, her particular popularity would probably come from the extreme prevalence of Amman
Right.
deities in Tamil Nadu, or
Hmm.
local mother goddess deities. And like I mentioned earlier, the most famous example of an Amman deity is Mariam. And you have Amman deities in the Telugu lands, they're called Ammorulu. But essentially, these Amman deities control various diseases, they provide protection to communities, to individuals, they protect boundaries, they ensure good rainfall, they ensure that crops do not fail. And so when Mary comes in, and again, as in a monotheistic religion such as Christianity, wherein God is perceived to be male, the popularity of a female figure such as Mary sort of fills a
Hmm.
vacuum of a mother, really. And when she comes into Tamil lands, even for new converts into Catholicism, Mary fills the vacuum that they lose in Amman deities, in not
Hmm.
worshipping Amman deities anymore. And again, it's a lot of local Hindus who visit shrines to Mary see Mary as another Amman deity, and as a form of, if I were to put it in a more Sanskritized term, as another form of feminine energy, another form of Shakti, really. And Mary in Velankri specifically, but as well as in other shrines in South India, she is a patroness of good health, just like an Amman deity would be, just like an Ammoru deity would be. And that sort of better contextualizes the popularity of figures such as Mary, as figures such as Anthony. They are more reachable figures because God in Christianity is, well, sort of at a metacosmic level, as it were. They aren't as approachable as human
Hmm.
because, well, they're God. It's God, so it's not always as easy to relate to God, really. But you can relate to human figures such as saints because, well, they're human. They are prone to human tendencies and mistakes. They're not divine figures per se, though they sort of take on supernatural powers in many ways. They aren't exactly divine, so they're more. That's sort of the Catholic logic behind approaching saints, but and when it kind of when it kind of blends into local religious traditions in Tamil Nadu and South India as such, it sort of emerges with a pre-existing tradition of approaching local deities, local local spirits, and other supernatural figures for help for very seemingly mundane things, really, because these are individuals and figures that are more approachable, that do not require priests or liturgies or textual ritual to
So
approach and
it's the
talk
same
to.
dynamic is we see similar dynamics in the spread of Buddhism, for example, right? You're not necessarily seeing the
Yeah,
veneration only of the Buddha as this abstract figure who has achieved nirvana, but rather as an actual physically present deity enshrined in stupas. And very soon after that, you have bodhisattvas who spring up, such as Avalokiteshvara, who is worshipped
yeah,
by merchants to ensure safe passage. You have Hariti, who is worshipped to ensure that childbirth happens smoothly. And I would actually go out on a limb and say that this is the reason why, though in some sections of Hindu society that we are aware of concepts such as Brahman, or the concept of Shunya the Advaita Vedantic God. In practice, it's very often the gods who are more closely tied to our daily lives, such as Ganesha, who you can pray to before an exam. I don't know why I'm talking so much about exams today. Who really tend to become the most popular and the most beloved of the gods, right? And it's very interesting to see how these dynamics don't really end. They're not exclusive to any particular religious community. They seem to be indicative of a more deeper human need to be able to reach out to the supernatural for help with the mundane. And it is so interesting to see how,
exactly.
in so many different contexts in India, in so many different communities with so many different kind of religious landscapes, again and again we see the same dynamic repeating, almost like the turning of a wheel, like the coming and going of a tide.
I thought I'd kind of leave you with a little personal anecdote, actually, that sort of sums up a lot of what we talked about. This is from a bit of field research that I had done a few months ago. In fact, last year. I was talking to a woman here in Hyderabad, and she gets possessed by the goddess Yellama. So individuals come to her every evening at this little shrine, by this little shrine she sits at, and they approach her. And while she is possessed, they ask the goddess Yellama for counsel, for healing, for cures from black magic, etc. In fact, before I spoke to her, a Muslim couple was actually consulting her, consulting Yellama, who had possessed this individual. And so we started talking. I started interviewing her, and in the course of the interview, she found out I was Christian, and she was like, "Oh, I go to the church in Metagoda every Tuesday, and I'm very fond of Saint Anthony here. And Metagoda is an area in Secunderabad which has a very popular shrine amongst local Catholics as well as a lot of Hindus to Saint Anthony." And now, I wouldn't generally be surprised that she goes to the shrine because I knew that, well, a lot of Hindus do go there to pray to Anthony. But the fact that this is an individual who gets possessed by a local goddess, in fact, during deity possession, she is essentially believed to be the goddess during the period of possession. She makes it a point. So Tuesdays are days dedicated to St. Anthony. She makes it a point to go every Tuesday to visit Anthony and pray there. And that's what's so fascinating about these traditions. I think last time we talked more in terms of myths and legends, and these can at times seem to be very abstract concepts when we limit ourselves to talking just about myths and legends. But when we see these practices, when we see individuals actively crossing these so-called boundaries we make between religions and just trying to find solace and peace within in any space that they can, I think we really need to begin to give more importance towards understanding these rituals, these traditions, respecting them, and just talking about it more, really. We don't necessarily have to believe in them. We don't necessarily have to practice them. But they open our eyes to how much more complex the world is, how much more complex religion and belief is. And sometimes how basic it can be, in the sense that it all boils down to us just trying to survive in this world, really.
Well said. And on that note, thank you so much for actually talking to us about this, Vivek. I learned a lot in this conversation. I'm really sure that our listeners have as well. So, as always, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on All Things Policy. And I hope that we will see you back again very soon.
Thanks, Anirudh.
My pleasure. And as always, thank you all so much for listening to All Things Policy.
The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, CET, CRED, and Global Victoria. We thank you so much for making all of this possible. So this week on Cyrus Says, Tapsi Pannu was recently featured in the Netflix original Haseen Dilruba was on. They discussed her experiences in Bollywood and a whole lot more. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi enlightens us with his wisdom on how one can get freedom from their own thoughts or insecurities when they communicate with others. On The Millennial Athlete, Tanvi and Shlok fill us in on all the drama from the world of sports with Wimbledon, Euros, and World Test cricket making headlines every day. On Postcards from Nowhere, Utsav Mamoria kicks off a new series, Beneath the Veneer. We travel to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, where he takes us through his first experience of encountering the Red Sea. We have a brand new show, Misconduct. It's a true crime show hosted by Ragvi, a lawyer, and Nisha, a PR pro. They tell us about the story of Cyanide Malika, the lady who offered cyanide-laden sweets to women and after they die, loot their gold. On the Global Victoria Tech Talks podcast, we showcase some compelling new tech stories coming out of Melbourne. On one episode, Pawan Srinath speaks to Joe Agan from Nelnet International, where they discuss how the pandemic has affected the edtech sector and its evolution. Another episode has Varun Dugirala talking to Ross Simons from Big Ant Studios about the gaming ecosystem and how they envision translating a sport to a game. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Come learn and experience the ABCDs of being queer with me, Shunetro,
and me, Farhad,
on our show, Gay BCD.
The two of us take you through our stories and experiences of being gay men in the city of Mumbai and have candid
and sometimes downright scandalous
conversations about sexuality, gay culture, and everything in between.
Catch new episodes of Gay BCD every Tuesday on the IVM Podcasts website, app, or wherever you get all your podcasts from.